Chris, Tally, and Spencer Osmond for affording me this opportunity. I really do welcome the opportunity to talk about these texts and these topics in a wider way than just within the confines of the scholarly world. And I realize that many of you who don't have experience studying philosophy or just reading it out of interest may not have a really clear, confident idea of what it is. And so I just want to take a couple of minutes here at the beginning to say a little bit about what in the world philosophy is. And begin with a short anecdote. In around 1979, 1980, I was at a party of graduate students. Most of us were doctoral candidates in philosophy. And one topic of conversation at the party was, how did the stranger on a plane or the stranger on a train react when they asked you, what are you doing? And you told them you were getting a doctorate in philosophy. Sometimes people would just sort of turn away and pretend you weren't there. Or they might say, oh, that's like psychology, isn't it? Well, not really. That's like theology, isn't it? Well, not really. But the best response that somebody reported was, oh, what are your sayings? Now, philosophers don't sit around thinking up sayings. Nonetheless, there are very important connections between philosophy and what you might call the plain person's view of the world. And that's what I want to talk about for a couple of minutes here at the start. The relationship between the common sense view of the world, the scientific view of the world, and the philosophical view. And by the common sense view, all I mean is the sort of view that an ordinary, aware, alert person would have without having studied a lot of theories about biology or chemistry or physics. So, amongst things that are part of the common sense view of the world would be the following: that there are many kinds of objects, that objects exist while I'm not looking at them, that there are smells and colors and sounds, that various aspects of nature seem to work in a highly regular way. Very, very commonsensical beliefs. The scientific view is sort of rooted in the common sense view, but develops in a somewhat different way, in the sense that from the standpoint of the sciences, what is being looked for is an integrated, explanatory view of things. So finding out whether particular symptoms are caused by a virus or by a bacteria, and finding out how that's transmitted, and understanding causal relations in fine-grained and highly detailed ways. And one of the interesting aspects of the scientific view of the world is that it departs from the common sense view in some respects. For example, the way honey tastes when you eat half a teaspoon of honey, is very distinctive, easily recognizable. The taste of honey is not in the honey in exactly the same way the taste is experienced. There are properties of the honey that cause that experience, but it's not as though the experience mirrors the taste any more than the whirlies or intoxication is in a bottle of whiskey. Okay? The way you see the room moving around when you've had too much to drink is caused by the drink, but it's not something that's in the drink in the same way that you experience it. So there are interesting ways in which the scientific view and the common sense view are both connected, but the scientific view also diverges from common sense and asks some very difficult questions about it. You know, what really are the statuses of things like smells and colors and sounds? You know, being uncomfortably loud is not an objective property of anything, even though we might all agree that, you know, certain sounds are uncomfortably loud. Anyway, what's philosophy got to do with this? You know, if science is seeking to give an explanatory account of the world, what's there left for philosophy? And sometimes people have argued that all philosophy really is are the scientific questions that haven't been answered yet. And I believe that's an erroneous view, and that in fact, whatever the state of development of the sciences, there are unavoidable philosophical issues that are enduring in the sense that the discovery of this or that particular fact is not going to be the resolution of the philosophical issue. So, for example, the relationship between concept and object. You know, we might think, oh, well, that's really just about perception, and perception is a scientific issue. Well, no, the relationship between concept and object can involve perception. But what that relation is, and who's leading in the dance, you know, do our concepts mirror real distinctions amongst things in the world, or does our view of the world reflect a set of conceptual choices that ultimately are conventional? That's a philosophical question. And questions about whether, or we might all agree that certain actions are morally wrong. But the question of what does the wrongness of a morally wrong action consist in is actually a philosophical question. You know, we can all agree that cruelty is wrong. And we can all agree on various descriptions of cruel behavior. But what the wrongness consists in, as I say, that's a philosophical question. And that's not to say that it's simply open to whatever sayings or whatever view one wants to endorse, but it is a way of saying there are genuine, substantive, unavoidable, enduring questions that will not be exhausted by the natural and social sciences, and that certainly are not resolved by common sense. Now, when we look at medieval philosophy, one of the things you notice right from the start is what a powerful influence the ancient inheritance had. So, you know, I'm talking mainly about philosophers from around 900 to 1250. Okay? And Aristotle died in 322 BC. So there's hundreds and hundreds of years there between the death of Aristotle and the way that I'm talking about medieval philosophy. And Plato was a couple of decades older than Aristotle, so he was born even earlier. And you might look at this, and it might seem to you that medieval philosophers weren't very original. They weren't very intellectually creative. It kind of looks like they were borrowing from the ancient inheritance, hooking it up as successfully as they could to their religious beliefs, and, voila, calling that their philosophy. That view, I think, is a serious misrepresentation and very unfair to the medievals. One of the reasons the ancient inheritance was so important is because several of the ancients did such a remarkable job of identifying and formulating what some of these unavoidable, enduring issues and questions are. And that's the mark of somebody's philosophical greatness. Namely, if their formulation of the problem just doesn't go away. And so, the medievals recognized the depth and the greatness of some of the ancients and went to work on those issues in ways that were shaped by their own intellectual context. And here's where someone might say, but their intellectual context was just saturated with religion. So Maimonides, that's Aristotle plus Judaism. Al-Farabi, that's Aristotle plus Islam. Aquinas, that's Aristotle plus Christianity. That caricature is a very serious misrepresentation. One reason it's a misrepresentation is the subtext when one says that kind of thing is these were people who were committed to certain dogmas. They were not going to surrender or modify those dogmas, so they knew how the theories were going to come out, no matter how they started. And that, too, is not fair, frankly, to the medievals. And as I say, for a couple of reasons. One is, in any era, including our own, there are going to be certain prevailing perspectives, attitudes, ways of seeing things. So somebody who got a perspective on modern Western culture, the culture that we're living in, they might say, the dominating, the prevailing conception of the world that these people have is basically naturalistic. They think that science is the pinnacle of knowledge, and they think that ultimately genuine questions have naturalistic answers. That is, answers that don't involve revelation, answers that don't involve anything non-empirical. Now, I'm not saying that that's exactly how all of us think, but I think it is a fair characterization of the sort of intellectual and broader culture overall. If the Middle Ages was a period of faith, this is a period of naturalism, or scientific naturalism. So for one thing, it's not as though the medievals made some unique error in having certain starting points. People in every era have certain starting points. What really matters, and where their greatness or lack of greatness shows up, is where they go from their starting points and how they get there. And the medievals were certainly not just adding religious beliefs to what was basically a pagan philosophy. For one thing, you can't do that. You can't do that in the following sense, that the Abrahamic monotheisms differ fundamentally from the ancient inheritance inheritance in the respect that monotheisms all involve creation, revelation, and a kind of redemptive providence. Those change everything. You know, it's not as though you can have, well, let's just add revelation, creation, and so forth to Aristotle. That you can't do. Now, I've been talking for about 12 minutes, and please feel free to speak up, ask a question, make any observation that you'd like to make. I don't want to simply talk at you, but I did want to get a few basic things out right here at the beginning. And if I've said something that's terribly unclear, please just bring it to my attention. It would be a shame for the unclarity to just sort of resonate through everything that follows. Anyway, let me connect what I just said about creation, revelation, and redemptive providence to the ancient imperatives. How can you connect that? You might, if you had a chance to look at the readings that were selected, in the Aristotle reading, I included a little bit of an excerpt from Book 1 of his Ethics, and a little bit of an excerpt from the final book of his Ethics, Book 10. The reason I selected those is what Aristotle does at the very beginning of the Ethics and at the end is he highlights what he takes to be the kind, specific end for a human being. That is to say, he held the view that there's such a thing as getting a human life right, in the sense that it is a flourishing life, rather than a failed or corrupted or depraved life. He also thought that the core element of realizing that end, which is intrinsic to our nature, is intellectual activity. The reason he thought that was, one reason he thought that is, look, we share with the plants the fact that we're alive. So just being alive can't be what a human life is fundamentally about. And we share with dogs, sheep, and cattle that we have some psychological states. We have sensations. We have feelings. And cattle can experience pain and even fear of a sort, so forth. So that doesn't distinguish us from other animals. What distinguishes us, he held, is that we're capable of formulating and pursuing our conception of what is good for us. Okay? And that's the place where one can, or where one fails, to, so to speak, get life right. Are you pursuing what, in fact, are genuine goods for a human being? And preeminent among those genuine goods is understanding. You know, a huge amount of literature and theater in the last 100 years has been motivated by the thought that life is meaningless, or it's been motivated by the thought that if there's any meaning in life, it's something that comes from inside of us. It's not a matter of knowing something. And that's very un-Aristotelian. In Aristotle's view, a human being is at home in the world by understanding it. That's what it is to not be alienated from the world that we live in. It's to have a kind of deepened and enlarged understanding. Now, that sort of intellectualism was actually picked up and pursued by the medievals. Okay? Were they religious thinkers? Yes, obviously they were religious thinkers. But the philosophers among them, so I'm not talking about mystics or poets or even, say, scriptural commentators. I'm talking about medieval philosophers. The medieval philosophers, in general, endorsed that kind of what's often called intellectual perfectionism. Where the difference comes in is they thought we get help. That's what Revelation is about. Their view was our best understanding of human nature and the capacities and the abilities and the sensibilities of human beings shows that if we aren't guided by getting help from outside ourselves, we're very likely to go off the rails. And we're very likely to make very serious mistakes about what we think is worth doing, what is a good kind of life to lead, and so forth. And, for example, this little book that's in the middle here is some works of Al-Farabi, a great Islamic thinker in the 10th century. And I opened to a page where he says that political order is such that what has authority is wisdom. That politics is not democratic, politics is not about majorities or even about voting. It was Al-Farabi's view that human beings will make a horrible mess of politics unless they are guided by wisdom. And what he meant by wisdom was a correct understanding of the good. And what he meant by a correct understanding of the good was an understanding that involves our best grasp of things, but also enhanced by what has been revealed to us. That's what is ultimately what enables us to be at home in the world, to have a relationship with God, and a relationship through knowledge. And it might come as a little bit of a surprise that Maimonides in the Jewish tradition and Aquinas in the Christian tradition pretty much held exactly the same view. Okay? They each regarded a different revelation, a different prophecy, as the final and authoritative prophecy. But they also each held that what that prophecy does, the prophecy given in the Revelation, is it provides us with the guidance that we need to enable us to come ever closer to God, and coming ever closer to God involves faith, but ultimately is largely a matter of understanding. But the world is so difficult to understand that we are given a huge amount of assistance via revelation. Yes, Harold.
One of the things you said that struck me was monotheist. One of the things I imagine I'm shouting loud enough to hear that. You said that the creation, revelation, change, and redemption of the monotheistic tradition changed everything. And with Aristotle, my understanding was there were creation stories creator-centered oriented in the world typically?
Aristotle believed that the world, and I don't just mean, planet Earth, I mean, what is. Aristotle believed that what is has simply always been. Okay? That it didn't come into being and it wasn't brought into being by a being that possessed intellect and will. The world simply has always been. And one of the things that the monotheisms regarded as unacceptable in Aristotle's philosophy is that he basically regarded the existence of the world as necessary, not as dependent upon a being of intellect and will. Okay? So, every one of the people that I mentioned, was critical of Aristotelianism because it didn't have a role for creation. And when I said that creation and revelation and redemptive providence change everything, I mean, roughly what I meant by that, if I'm trying to formulate it as a saying, would be something like this, that the world is not ultimately inscrutable and mysterious, and our existence is not ultimately inscrutable and mysterious. And one way that we know that is through the guidance that has been revealed to us, that better helps us understand our origin and our end. And that means there's a relationship with God that you simply could not find in Aristotle's or Plato's philosophy. Correct? Oh, I'm sorry.
So you mentioned that there's sort of prerequisites. And when I was reading Aristotle, he's talking about creating a society, the way I read it is where people knew and understood and perhaps even cared about what is just and what is right. And then he says that you need to be a competent student of that in order to contribute to that. And you must have first received a proper upbringing in moral conduct. And you must have the acceptance of a fact as a starting point. It seems to me a tenuous foundation to support a society that cares about and knows about what is just and right. And once you click that, and it doesn't go from parent to child or student to teacher to student, we find ourselves, here.
Yeah. I mean, in some respects, that's an excellent way to follow up the issue that Carol raised. And it also points to something that I did want to emphasize in the next few minutes, which is Aristotle put an enormous amount of weight on the importance of what he called habituation. That before a young person is capable of reasoning clearly and controlling their passions and deliberating in a mature and cool-headed way, before a young person gets to that point, they need to be habituated in such a way that they are disposed towards the right things, so that as their rational capacities develop, they will find the right things pleasing and desirable, and so forth. So Aristotle regarded habituation as extremely important. The connection with the issue that you raise is, what if the people that you're surrounded by are ethically corrupt? You're going to be habituated into ethical corruption. And that's another key point of difference between, say, the Greeks, to put it bluntly, and the Abrahamic monotheists. Because what the monotheists tell us is it doesn't matter who you're surrounded by, you there is the guidance that Revelation provides you. And so, even if you have started out in a way that involves wrongly directed habits, you're capable of retrieving yourself because the guidance is still accessible to you. And one really interesting difference between Aristotle and the medievals is Aristotle thought that once you've acquired a second nature, once you've got the character that you have as a mature individual, that's who you are. And it is extremely unlikely that you're going to see things differently or even have any interest in seeing things differently because your dispositions and your responses and your patterns of choosing are all, habituated in a certain way. So he basically said, you really need to look out for what you're doing because the things you do will shape what you are like. And once you are like something as an adult, it's going to be almost impossible to change. If you read Maimonides, and actually in some of the texts that I copied for this salon, and if you read the Islamic and Christian thinkers as well, there's a genuine role for repentance. There's a genuine role for reordering one's dispositions. Now, there could only be a genuine role for that kind of reordering if correct guidance is somehow accessible. And they believe it is accessible. Even if the people around you are no good. Okay? So on the one hand, they thought that as a matter of knowledge, we are never abandoned to our own corruption. And they also thought that as a matter of volition, as a matter of will, we are not abandoned to our own depravity because they held part of what's integral to being a human being is a form, it's a hugely complicated matter, but a form of freedom of the will that enables you to reorient yourself if you finally figure things out. If you get the message and you see the truth of it, there is a way for you to follow through and refashion your character to some extent. Yes?
Yeah, so my interpretation is that monotheism felt more paternal, like it was appealing more from a paternalistic, and Aristotle felt more within. Is that kind of?
Well, certainly the monotheists held that we're not alone, and that who is with us is bigger and better than us. In other words, who is with us can offer guidance it would be wise of us to follow. If you want to characterize that as a kind of paternalism, I know what you mean, but actually what seems to me especially important about it is the way it results in a different conception of volition and understanding. That we literally have capacities for volition and understanding that were not recognized by the Greeks. And just quickly here, I was emphasizing the tremendous importance of habit in Aristotle. In the monotheists, and this is especially something that is centrally important is tradition. And habituation and tradition are different things. Because the way that the monotheists understood tradition was that it's not simply antiquity. You know, that if we're still doing something people did 7 generations ago, you know, let's call that tradition. That's not what they meant. And in the reading that I copied from Sajid is a 10th century Jewish thinker from what is now Iraq. He was the head of one of the major Talmudic academies of the 10th century. He's a key figure in setting the agenda of medieval Jewish philosophy, and I deliberately included him because I thought most of you probably had never heard of him before. It's worth knowing about. But anyway, the passages that I selected from Sajid are passages where he says that in addition to rational self-evidence, logical inference, and sense perception, tradition is also a source of knowledge. So it's not just tradition in the sense that this is what my parents did, this is what my grandparents did, I guess this is what I will be doing. You know, whether or not it says anything true about what the world is like, or whether God exists, or you know what a good life is. You know, Sajid, and it's true of the other thinkers as well, regarded tradition as a source of knowledge that we desperately need. And in a way, the reason for our needing it is actually pretty commonsensical. Namely, if you think about just about every belief that you have that you regard as true, you know, beliefs about very pedestrian, ordinary, unimportant things, and beliefs about bigger and more important things. Just about every belief that you have relies upon the testimony of others. Okay? So if I tell a classroom of students that Napoleon was defeated in Waterloo on June 18, 1850, by Wellington and Blucher, the British and the Prussians, they'll dutifully write this down. And they can later on, if somebody asks them, gee, you know when the Battle of Waterloo was? If they remember, they'll say, yeah, that was June 1850. They have done no research to find out if that's true. They were trusting me as a reliable, pedagogical authority, and I wasn't messing with them. I was giving them the actual data. And I just mean this as a very, very down-to-earth example of the fact that a huge amount of what we believe on the basis of testimony, not on the basis of direct sense perception, or even on the basis of our own rational inferences. We accept what the Britannica says. We accept what our professors told us. And in most cases, that's the right thing to do, because, at least a couple of authorities that I've mentioned are pretty darn reliable. So anyway, Sajid is very emphatic about saying that tradition is amongst the most important sources of epistemic authority, sources of reliable knowledge. Okay? And as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, habit and tradition are different things, because what these thinkers mean by tradition has to do with the transmission of understanding that would be for each one of us to try and arrive at on our own. Now, interesting wrinkle in this is several of the medievals had a kind of sophisticated view about rhetoric. And basically, their view was, when we're talking about a society overall, there are some people who can understand and will be able to follow very careful, step-by-step, rational discourse and inference. There are other people who are going to need to rely on images, other kinds of representation, stories, and so forth. But the rational inferences and the stories can both be modes of access to the same truths. So there was a little bit of a debate in the Middle Ages about whether there are two truths. Could there be truths of revelation that are inconsistent with rational truths? And could there be truths of reason that are incompatible with truths of revelation? Most significant medieval philosophers concluded, no, there's one body of truth. Some people need to understand it by reading, let's say, Quran or the Hebrew Bible as though it's literally talking about the characteristics that God has. Okay? While others will be able to understand that these scriptures include, a great deal of imagery and a great deal of rhetorical flourish and so forth to make points especially effectively. So, one of the differences in their view of society, in contrast to ours, is, as I mentioned 40 minutes ago, their answer to the question, what's the basis of political legitimacy? Or what has the authority to govern a political community? Their answer is wisdom, understanding, a correct grasp of human good, which involves, in all sorts of very important ways, a correct understanding of revelation. Now, that's a very undemocratic way of understanding politics. But one of the issues that I wanted to raise tonight, because I thought, gosh, if anything is discussable, this probably is this question of whether a society needs a shared conception of human good, even if it's a quite flexible and elastic one. Whether a society or a political community needs a shared conception of human good and one that is grounded in sound understanding, or is the whole point of modern liberal democracy to get away from exactly that kind of picture?
And I think this is very interesting. And when you talked about Sajja and the idea of as tradition as a source of knowledge, and this idea of transmission of understanding, and who are the rational influence. And I think, right, with the topic for tonight, I'm thinking about artificial intelligence, and I'm a neophyte in that. But what I think I have started to understand is that it's really all about the prompt or the query. There's a technical term, but how do you train the AI? It's all about where do you focus the language model, right, to bring in that data, and how I think it's very interesting that in today's society that we're research, and we are really going to be lost because now influencers and AI is all going to depend upon where the AI is being trained, and I'm guessing the ancient texts and traditions are not where the AI is going to be focused.
I'm not the computer scientist in the room, but I'm inclined to think that the gist of the point you were making is accurate. One sort of revision in your formulation that I would make is that the very notion of an influencer is not intrinsically a notion of transmitting understanding. It's a notion of effectiveness. And one can transmit effectiveness which involves nothing but corrupt and inaccurate understanding. And so there's a respect in which there might unavoidably be a role for criteria of sound understanding that are not fully domesticated by influence. Okay? Because you can have loads of influence that does not transmit sound understanding. You know, as I said, it seems to me quite discussable that these were people who, and here's where the paternalism might seem to be almost, sort of unavoidably pronounced. These are thinkers who believe that there are objective considerations of human good, that the project of politics is to enable as many people as possible to lead flourishing lives by realizing those goods. At the same time, these thinkers are recognizing that the majority of people are likely to do a really bad job of this. And so they all make a distinction between sort of the wise and the vulgar. And by the vulgar, they don't mean it in a sort of pejorative, condescending way. They mean, look, there is such a thing as correct understanding, or its absence, and politics will be disastrous unless it is sort of broadly oriented by correct understanding. And the majority of people won't have a combination of the natural aptitude and the education that's needed to attain that understanding on their own. But we've got religion. And religion, and this doesn't have to be interpreted in a sort of dogmatic, intolerant way. I just mean religion in the sense that indicated earlier, that we get help. But there's religion, and that is equally accessible to anybody. And so the guidance is available to everyone. Yes?
So, if you've got a standard of truth that can be extended to everybody in the society, or potentially extended to all, you're still working with a very unhuman ability to receive that truth. That the hoi polloi are going to be largely out of touch with the finer points. So that there are some readings of this tradition, of all three of these traditions, that say, well, there is an esoteric element to the tradition that will only go to the cognoscenti. And then there is the popular, somewhat
is a very delicate and difficult political project. Just as an aside, I find these thinkers complex and difficult enough without the layers of Straussian interpretation being added to it. I mean that quite literally. And you know, was Maimonides, look, the book of Maimonides that's probably heard of by more people than other of his works is a large work called The Guide for the Perplexed. And The Guide for the Perplexed is a hundreds of pages long book that was basically a letter that he was writing to a former student of his, a young man named Joseph, who was studying philosophy, found philosophy very powerful, and was beginning to have, if not concerns, at least questions about whether this is underlying to his faith communities. And so Maimonides writes The Guide for the Perplexed as an answer to this. There are numerous scholars who would argue that Maimonides didn't really believe. He wasn't really a committed Jewish believer, but he saw the importance of religion for the sort of sustaining of the community of Jews in exile, scattered all over the place. He saw that there was a role for religious belief with regard to morality and with regard to the solidarity of the Jewish people, wherever they happened to be, and so forth. For what it's worth, and it's worth very little, at least right here, I don't think he was trying to find a way of giving a merely instrumental role to religion. I think he was genuinely taking up this question of whether the world was created or whether it's always been there, and how do we figure that out? And he was genuinely taking up the question of, backtrack for a second. He endorsed a great deal of what Aristotle said about ethics. And he endorsed a great deal of what Aristotle said about what the virtues are. But he said, Maimonides said explicitly, there are two states of mind with regard to which it is not correct to have a disposition that lies in the need. Because Aristotle's view was that courage is a mean between reckless boldness on one hand and cowardice on the other. And temperance is a mean between overindulgence, concupiscence at one end, and what he called boorishness or insensibility on the other. And Aristotle said that, for most virtues, there's a way of seeing that each of them lies in the mean. Maimonides says, that is true of almost all virtues, except with regard to anger and humility. And he says, the person who is angry, it's as though he worships idols. And I think what he meant was, if you let your anger get the better of you as a passion, it will corrupt your judgment, and you will become, consumed with the need to hit back rather than the need to repair, or whatever would be most ethically sound in the situation. So he says that we can't agree with Aristotle with regard to anger or with regard to humility. And basically, the point that he's making about humility is not that we should regard ourselves as wretched or allow ourselves to be stepped on, but that compared to God, humility sort of attitude to have towards one's own status and one's own standing. And Maimonides very strongly endorses claims like that. And that seems to me a way of saying, look, what is transmitted to us in the religious tradition is extremely important. And this isn't just something that I think is a good idea instrumentally. Yeah, Carol and Greg?
I would disagree with whoever mentioned that Maimonides was not a man of faith. He wrote the 13 Principles of Faith. Most of them begin with "I believe" or "You should believe" or something along those lines. I think he just was a combination of a man of faith who also was scientific. He was a medical doctor. He was a pragmatist. He lived very much in this world, and he understood that these character traits, that you should live in the middle, in moderation, but every once in a while you might swing to one of those far sides, but you shouldn't live there. And anger could be ideally used as long as you didn't feel it, as long as you just were using it as a tool. But he also, more like Aristotle, it wasn't about revelation or God. I mean, he says in the writings you shared that it's up to you as a man to revisit your character traits, to look inside yourself, to be reflective. No one's going to help you do that. I mean, God may have given you the ability to do it, but now it's sort of up to you. So that always struck me as something very pragmatic and less religious.
Greg, I don't see that the pragmatism and the sort of genuine faith commitment need to knock each other out in any respect. That, look, these are all thinkers who believe that the faith commitments are the most valuable guidance we have with regard to how to lead our lives. So in that sense, religion has tremendously important practical significance. If you would, though, remind me for a second, the very first point that you made. I want to try to retrieve that.
You said he wasn't really a believer, but then he wrote those principles.
Right, I got it. Yeah, Maimonides sort of famously wrote the 13 fundamental principles of Jewish faith. Okay, Maimonides lived from 1138 to 1204, just to place him. And for the 500 years prior to that, and continuing well into his lifetime and beyond, Jews were often being challenged by Christian authorities and by Muslim authorities to defend their faith. In other words, look, the Christian revelation came after yours, surely it supersedes it. There's no reason for anybody to be a Jew anymore. And then the Muslim might say, the prophet's revelation came after the New Testament. There's no reason for anybody to be a Christian anymore. Those prophecies have been superseded. Okay, and as I say, very often in official settings, the authorities would require Jews to make the case for their religion. And the fact that Maimonides wrote these 13 principles is especially striking because Judaism has no dogma. There's no catechism in Judaism. I mean, it's monotheistic, certainly, but it's not as though for centuries and centuries Jews have been, developing rival lists of fundamental principles. The very notion of formulating, as it were, a dogma is something that medieval Jews were basically compelled to do, not by their own commitments, but by the various different authorities under which they live. And believe me, I actually will stop talking for a while, but I do want to use this just as a sort of segue into one other, I think, quite important issue, which is that in both Judaism and Islam, despite the incredibly frictional and catastrophic contemporary political situation and so forth, in both Judaism and Islam, there's an integral role for the law and for jurisprudential thinking, and in that respect, those two faith traditions are much more like each other than either of them is like Christianity. And in fact, in the Quran, Moses is mentioned many more times than Muhammad. Moses the lawgiver, Moses the prophet, Moses the paradigm, lawgiver. And so the reason I think this is so important is for Judaism and for Islam, and to some extent for Christianity, but not in quite the same way, for Judaism and for Islam, tradition has to do with the ongoing elaboration, interpretation, and application of the law. The Torah, most of us are familiar with the Ten Commandments. In the Torah, there are 613 commandments. Okay? 603 besides the 10. And Maimonides' huge work, the Mishnah Torah, repetition of the Torah, is his classification of all the different commandments under specific headings. They concern all departments of life: contract and sales, inheritance, marriage, family, how to slaughter animals, which animals are permissible to eat, the calendar, ritual, worship, and so forth. Islam is very similar to Judaism in that regard. That the prophet brought a law for the people to live by. And so with those two traditions, you have not only as I put it, the epistemic significance, the knowledge authority of tradition, but the tradition is structured, and the architecture or the anatomy of the tradition is the laws that are contained in the revelation. Judaism and Islam, unlike Christianity, do not include long traditions of natural law. The Aquinas that I copied, just a couple of pages, just a few paragraphs. It's question 91 in the Summa. There's a number of questions that he raises and addresses concerning law. What law is, what kinds of law there are, so forth. And one of the kinds of law that he mentions is natural law. He says there's eternal law. By eternal law, he roughly means the idea of all that is in the mind of God. That's eternal law. Timeless, true comprehension of everything that is. There's eternal law. There's divine law, which is what is given in Revelation. There's human law, which kings and legislators bring into being and bring into effect. But he says there's also natural law. Okay? And he believes that natural law concerned fundamental principles of human good that are universal and that can be grasped by anyone, even if they're not a Christian. And the passage from the Aquinas that I included was that passage. says. These tribes, these barbarians, or Germans, or whoever it happened to be that he was referencing, he says they are capable in their hearts, it really means in the mind and their conscience, they are capable of understanding the fundamental principles of human good. So in Christianity, there's a kind of aspiration to universalization that's not found in the same way in Islam and in Judaism. Which is not to say that in Islam and in Judaism, there's no concern for universal validity. There is a concern for universal validity, but the point is our grasp of it comes through the details of the revelation and the way that the law has been given to us. So anyway, maybe as a concluding issue to raise here, in the U.S. in particular, there's been a great deal of controversy about the role of religion in public life and religion in politics. And there are many Americans who believe that there should be no public discourse about religion. That religion is an individual's business and it doesn't have a proper role in public political discourse. So it's a way of defending the freedom of religion, but also confining it, almost as though it's a hobby. It's not something that you bring to bear on your arguments with fellow citizens about how things should go. Many people who hold a view like that endorse something that has come to be called public reason. And what they mean by public reason is the only considerations that should enter into public political discourse are considerations that can be equally well understood by anybody without any reliance on a particular tradition or a particular revelation. So if considerations don't meet the test of public reason, they need to be, or they should be, excluded from politics. The medievals held the view that the kinds of considerations that are authoritative with regard to the political order and to governance are the considerations of practical wisdom. What I was earlier calling the authority of wisdom, the authority of a correct conception of good. And so there's a very, very important contrast and some really interesting and complicated relations between a conception of practical wisdom and a conception of public reason and the implications of those conceptions for what our politics should be like. And one other issue here that I'll mention having to do with this is that many defenders of contemporary liberal democracy argue that one of its great virtues is that it keeps the state out of the business of telling people how to lead their lives. That's a very important part of what is meant by at least some conceptions of liberty. That the state does not enforce any specific and comprehensive conception of how people should lead their lives. So there's a kind of moral freedom that goes along with political freedom. There have got to be limits on this moral freedom. There have got to be limits on this political freedom. But, the defenders of individual liberty even if they believe that there is such a thing as practical wisdom, they don't believe that it's something that should be directing the state with regard to formulating and implementing its policies and initiatives. And so one thing to think about, a very, very important issue to think about, is if we're not going to expect or even welcome a widely shared, stable conception of human good, what will our politics need to look like? In other words, what are the values that we will need to regard as primary if we don't regard the realization of practical wisdom as primary? So, one might see the medievals as paternalistic and as thinking that there are natural elites, and that's a thought that can be quite offensive in some ways. On the other hand, from their perspective, politics is likely to do a very poor job of encouraging human flourishing if we just leave it up to every individual to figure out what is most important. I'll stop there because I've talked to you all, but I'm very happy to talk more if you have anything you'd like to raise.
It's my understanding that each of these Abrahamic faiths are in fact dynamic. And they're dynamic philosophies. And if we're talking about struggling with contemporary issues and having a reference to the ethics of Abrahamic monotheism, where do we start? We start with these medieval philosophers. We start looking at where these religions are today, the fatwas, the response of other forms of ethical statements of these religions.
It's a perfectly fair and very important consideration to raise. I was mentioning to Chris and to Spencer before we got underway here, that if you turn all the pages of the Quran, you find pages where it looks very clearly like there should be no coercion in religion. And it looks very clearly like if this community does not share our faith commitments, it's fine as long as they're not doing horrendous things and so forth that no one should do. And there are passages that basically say, convert or die. Okay? Or that say, if Islam has political sovereignty, then anybody living under the Islamic rule, has to either be a Muslim, leave, or die. And you can find textual bases for what seem to be very, very contradictory views. And in fact, if you look at the history of the Jews in Europe, or if you look at Maimonides' biography, he was born in Cordoba, Spain, during a period of, quite a remarkable sort of efflorescence in Muslim and also Jewish intellectual life. And the Jews were, basically welcomed, not forced to convert, not expelled, not murdered, but then a different group from North Africa crossed the waters, got control of the Muslim-governed part of Spain and told the Jews, get out, or you won't live until morning. And so Maimonides had to leave. He went to Fez. He was in the Holy Land for a short while, and then he was Suleiman's physician. You know, I mean, he had a very important position in the Muslim court in Egypt. So you do get this, bewildering, crazy quilt of interactions between the different traditions and so forth. And you can find textual support for just about any position. But that's also a sense in which these religions are. You know, somebody might say, well, that's a way for a religious tradition to be incoherent. It looks like it would justify, literally any damn thing. Okay? Another way of looking at it is, you know what? These texts are very faithful to the realities of what human beings are like. And there is scope here for a kind of flexibility, a kind of plasticity, because not everything is laid out in completely unambiguous terms, without any opportunity for straying to the left or to the right of that path. And it is a sorrowful thing that each of the traditions can be found to be a source of something we regard as ugly and menacing. They are also sources of many of the ideas and ideals most of us probably regard as fundamentally important. And they weren't founded primarily as rationalizations for power grabs.
Some lawyers who I know have interpreted the Constitution based upon what the rules were when it was drafted back in the 1700s. And some people think it should be an evolving document that changes as times change. I wonder what you think about some of the philosophers, for example, Derek Perfect, who thinks that things are always changing, that what you say you believe 20 years ago is not necessarily what you believe now or what you believe 20 years from now.
This is not a very illuminating remark, but I guess it's a autobiographical one. In some respects, I see Parfit as brilliantly mischievous, because he's so skilled at finding the places where people like to think there are foundations and they're not, or that the issue is more dynamic than has been typically held by philosophers. But I'll try to say something that speaks to your question in just a few seconds. But the court and the interpretation of law has come up at least once or twice in the session, and some people interpret the Constitution as, and it seems as though some members of the Supreme Court interpret the Constitution as reflecting natural law. And I think one of the really important jurisprudential debates in the U.S. is the debate about that very issue. Now, even if it reflects natural law, that wouldn't mean there's no scope for interpretation or adaptation. I mean, there are people who are really literalists about, look, this is what it says. You know, there isn't anything to argue about here. This is what it says. But I suspect that even the people who wrote it with a view in mind of politics involving a kind of dynamism and a kind of, occurrence of certain circumstances that we haven't predicted. We need some framework for addressing those. But even if one regards this as the right framework, that doesn't imply that it adequately addresses every problem that will come up. It just means that it can orient us in our thinking about how to address the problem. But also, there are conceptions of liberal democracy that are much more wide open to a kind of dynamism. That reject the notion of natural law and reject the notion of practical wisdom and see politics as pragmatics all the way down. And that, I think, is something that's very interesting to think about for oneself. Do I, in final analysis, regard politics as pragmatics all the way down? Or do I come to a place that, has weight and gravitas that I'm obliged to acknowledge? I've got a hunch that the silence is not a signal that this is all so transparent. There's just nothing more to say. Chris, is this about the time you wanted to?
Okay, we could wind it down here and begin to at least. I would add that the silence is perhaps because this group was conditioned to a 90-minute conversation. That's why we hit that point, but certainly I don't want to step in and cut it off if there's a thought or two that you would like to come forth as we do try to wrap it up. Anything from the professor? Yes, sir.
He posed the question at the beginning, what is the definition of philosophy? And in 5 to 50 words, I don't know, could you define that for us?
Well, actually, I was careful not to say the definition of it. I was talking about characterization. But I think one somewhat illuminating way to characterize it is that one of the things philosophy does distinctively is it critically examines what is taken for granted in the various special sciences and specific areas of inquiry. So there's a sense in which, if you're a chemist, there are a number of fundamental beliefs that you have about the world and about what's real and so forth that you're not going to question. And it's not because you're small-minded or dogmatic, it's that chemistry doesn't do that. Philosophy will look at what are the presuppositions people make when they're undertaking projects and scientific exploration. In fact, even the question, what is an explanation? You sometimes, in books on the history of ideas, see the claim that Aristotle held science back for 2,000 years until the Enlightenment, and And then the lights went on, and people figured out what real science is. I mean, on the face of it, it's a silly thing to say, but one of the things that we owe to Aristotle is a formal and very rigorous conception of what a scientific explanation is. And in some respects, it remains relevant. His empirical claims about how the world works, are full of all sorts of things we no longer accept. Full of things that weren't accepted 400 years ago as well. But, as I say, if you're looking at the basic conceptual architecture, looking at what is taken for granted, just very quickly, sort of imagine the following, that for any beliefs that you have, there are certain things it presupposes, and there are certain things it implies. So there's kind of a vertical structure. The belief is in the middle, the presuppositions are above it, the implications are below it, and then at the same level of it are zillions of other beliefs. And part of what philosophy does is it looks at the relationship between the vertical and the horizontal, and looks at what the connections are, or should be, between those things. Does that help a little bit? Or you just want me to stop? Anybody? Anyone else? Yeah.
Trying to get your opinion. In terms of politics, what do you believe is more important? Practical wisdom or power?
Why do you want to know?
Well, it seems you, I don't care what party you're in favor of, might be more interested in obtaining power in terms of how they can rule the future versus what might make sense in the present.
Yeah, I mean, another sort of confessional or autobiographical remark is this, that one of the things that I appreciate philosophy for, in other words, one of the ways in which I really feel it has helped me is that, at least with regard to various important aspects of life, I'm not interested in winning. I'm interested in understanding. Okay? Now, going on all around that are activities and issues and interactions that really are about power, and that really are about winning. Because there are always enough people to make that the main thing. So the Conjuring Act, I think, that one never perfects is how to help understanding to win. In other words, you have to play in the power context. It doesn't mean you have to lower yourself to whatever will succeed in the power context. But you have to recognize the reality of it, and that it's very hard to change a lot of people's minds about it. But really, really carefully controlling the extent to which you worsen yourself.
I've just finished reading the book, 1999, it's a little true that the Thomas Cahill the addition of Jewish thinking, monotheism, is it gives us a history that has a beginning, an end, purpose, and that previous polytheistic religions sort of gave a circular world, everything's a cycle, there's no beginning, no end. How does that fit in with kind of what we've been talking about? Is that,
Oh, I think
would that work, or what do you think?
No, I think that definitely fits in the sense that that's a way of saying that creation, revelation, and redemptive providence change everything. Even just creation does. Because the idea of creation isn't just that the inscrutable happened. It's that, you know, God is a being of intellect and will and created the world in a specific way. And, you know, then by revelation, provided people with guidance to live in that world, and through redemptive providence, gave them hope that even if they can't be at home in the world, they can be in union with God. That's not Greek. Really not Greek.
Worse than here. Or anything else.
Yeah, or anything